Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about what I consider the most important R&B album of the 90s. And in many ways, one of the most important R&B albums of the last 40 years. And this is TLC's second album, Crazy, Sexy, Cool. Now, this album was very unique because it was a bold statement in writing, in production, and in harmonization that marked the sort of firm end of the new jack swing era of R&B, a very influential but relatively short-lived era, and the area of the new R&B of the 90s that would help carry the genre into the 2000s. So let's just recap what R&B was like in the 80s. Obviously, before the 80s and the 70s, you have a golden age of R&B and soul and funk and so many music styles that were derived from the older versions of R&B, but whose artists were all somewhat interchangeable in the sense that they were musically versatile. Their talent allowed them to move around, and genre labels weren't as important. By the early 80s, the R&B world had sort of settled on a style of production and arrangement called electro funk. Some of this wasn't as good as others, but when it was done right, it was really good. Think Mtume, wonderful band. Think some of the Midnight Star records. Think of Between the Sheets, a great Isley Brothers album. The Isley Brothers really every genre of R&B and soul was covered by the Isley Brothers because again they were one of the most talented and versatile groups in all of music history. By the late 80s, this electrofunk style had given way to something called New Jack Swing, and this was sort of an attempt to use hip hop style beats in traditional R&B. Sometimes it worked, a lot of times it didn't. It probably worked best on the Pleasure Principle album by Janet Jackson. But when it wasn't done right, this genre tended to cheapen the production style. Someone needed to do something. And hip hop really led the way before R&B, interestingly, in terms of a production revolution in the 90s, when Dr. Dre and Warren G started using more sophisticated beats by more elaborate drum machines, using real synth pads, integrating a combination of real instruments and traditional analog 70s style synthesizers. It made the music more real, more groovy, more fresh. And the R&B world caught note of what was happening in the revolutionary hip hop world of the 90s. And they said, we need to get a bit more real in our sounds as well, while still keeping things contemporary. And the producer of this album was Larry Babyface Edmonds, who himself was in one of the finest funk soul groups of all time, if you ask me, in the 70s, a group called Manchild. They're on Spotify and the others, so definitely check them out. And he was the sort of mastermind behind this album. And he created a sound that was just right for the era. It was easy on the ears, where some of the new Jack Swing stuff could be a bit fatiguing, but it was still something that screamed, this is new. It wasn't by any means a throwback. The PT Cruiser might have been a throwback in the 1990s, but this album was not. The other reason that made this album successful were the individuals on it. It was one of these bands where you had people with, interesting characteristics, and that was a big thing in the 90s with all sort of vocal-based bands. You had Lisa Left Eye Lopez, you had T-Boz Watkins, and you had Chili Thomas, and between the three of them, they really had interesting and very likable personalities. And this came through not only in the vocals, but also in the music videos that the trio would make. The album sold really well, and I think that it opened up a lot of doors for both other R&B artists and other hip hop artists, because it was the 90s when R&B and hip hop sort of became very closely intertwined. There were obviously huge differences, but the similarities are what made a lot of people in the general record buying public very happy. Now, obviously, the band followed this album up with fan mail a few years later, but the band came to an end, unfortunately, when Lisa Left Eye Lopez died in a horrific car accident, some of which was actually captured on video. So this album really stands as somewhat of a time capsule into a decade whose musical styles outside of hip hop are not always so easy to define. But this album really did help to define what would become the mainstay style of R&B in the 1990s. Great songwriting, great production, great vocals, great personality. You really couldn't ask for more. Babyface and the three wonderful vocalists did a great job. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.